The clock on the sheriff's wall had never ticked so loudly in all the years it had hung there, and every single beat of it felt to Ira Brooks like a nail being driven into the lid of a coffin he hadn't yet climbed into. It was the autumn of 1882, and the sun over Caldwell, Kansas, was doing what it always did in October, burning low and orange across the flats, painting the dust red, making everything look like the world was already on fire. Ira stood in the middle of Main Street with a piece of paper folded in his coat pocket and the taste of copper at the back of his throat, and he stared down the road toward the edge of town, where the wagon trail disappeared into the grass and became nothing but distance. He had 1 hour. That was what Sheriff Doyle Prescott had told him, standing there with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes flat as river stones. 1 hour to collect what he owned, settle what debts he could, and be across the territorial line before the next man Prescott sent came looking for him, with something considerably less forgiving than a folded piece of paper. The charge was interfering with a federal land transaction, which sounded civilized and bureaucratic, but what it really meant was that Ira had stood in the street 2 days ago and told Burton Cal and his men that they would not be riding onto the Finley property while he had breath in his body to stop them. He had breath in his body still. Burton Cal had 3 broken fingers, a deputy had a split lip, and Ira Brooks had 1 hour. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, or at least, not entirely from fear. He had been afraid before, and he knew what pure fear felt like, and this was something mixed up with it, something heavier and warmer and considerably more complicated than simple dread. He was shaking because of Theodora Finley, because the one thing he could not bear to do in the hour he had left was walk away from her door without saying what he had never once in 14 months managed to say out loud. He had come to Caldwell the previous autumn as a working cowhand, answering a posting that a widow woman needed help running her late husband's cattle operation south of town. He had not expected much. He had drifted through 3 territories in 6 years, working horses and cattle, and once, briefly and miserably, a silver operation in Colorado that left him with a cough for 6 months, and a firm conviction that the earth was meant to be ridden across, not dug into. He had not expected Theodora Finley. She had met him at the gate on the first morning, her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that was at least 2 sizes too large, and clearly belonged to someone who was no longer living. She was 24 years old, already a widow, already running 43 head of cattle and a small horse operation on land her husband Charles Finley had bought 3 years before he died of a fever that swept through the county in the spring of 1880. She had a daughter, a serious-faced 7-year-old named June, who regarded Ira with the kind of frank suspicion only children and horses are truly capable of sustaining. Theodora had shaken his hand at that gate and looked him directly in the eye and said, "I pay fair wages and I expect fair work. I don't have patience for laziness or dishonesty, and I have very little interest in being managed. Can you work with that?" He had said yes. He had meant it completely. What he had not anticipated was that within a month he would find himself thinking about the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her. Not a polite laugh, not a careful one, but a sudden burst of real sound that she always seemed faintly embarrassed by afterward, like she hadn't meant to let it out. He had not anticipated learning the particular way she stood when she was thinking hard, with her arms crossed and her chin slightly tilted, as if she were listening to something just below the range of ordinary hearing. He had not anticipated the evenings on the porch when the work was done and June had gone to bed, and Theodora would sometimes sit with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and talk about the land, about what she wanted it to be, about the grass and the sky and the particular quality of the light just before a storm. She had talked to him like he was a person worth talking to. It had been, in ways he was not articulate enough to fully explain, one of the most significant things anyone had ever done for him. The trouble had started in the spring, when Bert and Cal had begun buying up parcels along the creek drainage south of town, building a cattle empire that needed water and didn't much care whose deed was already on file. Cal was the kind of man who existed all through that country in those years, a man with money behind him and lawyers in front of him, and a genuine conviction that the world was arranged specifically for his benefit. He had approached Theodora twice about selling. She had declined both times with a directness that clearly bewildered him, because he was a man accustomed to people folding when he pushed. She had not folded. She had written letters to the county land office. She had found an attorney in Wichita, a thin, tired man named Horace Webb who wore the same brown suit every time Ira saw him, and who nonetheless turned out to know more about property law than anyone in 3 counties. She had organized a meeting at the Methodist church with 4 other families who were facing similar pressure, and she had stood up in front of them all and laid out the legal situation with the kind of steady, clear-eyed competence that made Ira feel something shift permanently inside his chest. He had been watching her from the back of that church, leaning against the wall with his hat in his hands, and he had understood in that moment with absolute certainty that he was in love with Theodora Finley in a way that was going to be with him for the rest of his life whether she ever knew it or not. He had not told her. He was a working hand on her land. She was a widow with a child and a property dispute and 100 complicated burdens, and the last thing she needed was her hired man complicating matters with feelings she had no reason to return. He had kept it where he kept most things inside, quiet, where it couldn't do any harm. And then Bert and Cal's men had ridden onto her property on a Wednesday morning while she was at the schoolhouse picking up June, and they had begun surveying a section of the south pasture, based on a contested land claim that their attorney had filed without notice. Ira had been mending fence on the north property line when one of the neighboring ranchers, old Gus Esteban, had ridden over to tell him what was happening. He had gotten there on horseback in 12 minutes. He had put himself between Cal's men and the fence line they were attempting to mark, and he had told them in plain language that they were trespassing and that they would be leaving. When the deputy who rode with them had tried to push past him, things had gotten physical quickly and badly, and by the time it was over, Ira had made enemies of Bert and Cal and of Doyle Prescott, who was Cal's man through and through no matter what the badge on his chest said. The arrest had come the next morning. The charges were flimsy, but the intent behind them was clear enough: get Brooks out of the territory and remove the most significant physical obstacle between Cal's surveyors and Theodora Finley's property line. Now Ira had 1 hour, and his hands were shaking, and he was standing in the middle of Main Street looking toward the road south as if it might offer him some different answer than the one he already knew. He could fight the order. Horace Webb had said as much when Ira had sent word to him, the scrawled note carried by a boy for 20 cents. Webb had said the charges were thin as paper and the exile order was almost certainly illegal under territorial statute, and that if Ira gave him 2 weeks, he might be able to get the whole thing overturned. 2 weeks, and Prescott's deadline was 1 hour. And beyond the legal technicalities was the very practical reality that if Ira was still in Caldwell when Prescott's patience ran out, things would not go well, and if things went badly enough, Theodora's situation would become worse, not better, because the story would shift from a legal property dispute to something involving a violent troublemaker, and Cal would use it to paint her as a woman who harbored dangerous men. He would leave. He knew he would leave. He had known it before he finished reading the paper Prescott had put in his hand, but he could not make himself walk toward his horse. His feet were moving in the other direction entirely, down the side street, along the dust-packed path between the hardware store and the dry goods, out toward the south edge of town, where the houses thinned out, and the land opened up, and the small frame house with the blue-painted door sat back from the road behind a gate he had fixed 3 times in 14 months, because the latch was designed by someone who had apparently never encountered wind. He fixed it a fourth time out of pure habit, his fingers working the mechanism as he came through, and then he was standing in front of the door, and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't have knocked if he'd wanted to. He wanted to. He stood there wanting to for what felt like a very long time. The door opened before he managed it. Theodora Finley stood in the doorway with flour on her right hand, and a look on her face that told him she had known he would come, which was somehow both better and worse than if she'd been surprised. She was wearing a dark blue dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her hair was coming down from its pins on the left side, the way it always did by this hour of the afternoon, a single dark wave falling against her cheek. Her eyes were brown, very steady, and right now they were reading his face with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered to her. "I heard," she said. Her voice was quiet. "I know," he said. "I know you did." They looked at each other through the open door, and the afternoon light came in at an angle between them, full of dust motes, full of the particular golden thickness of an October evening in Kansas, and Ira thought with a kind of desperation that he was going to carry this light with him wherever he went, that it was going to be the light behind his eyes every time he closed them for the rest of his life. "Come in," she said. He shook his head. "I don't have time. I know how much time you have." There was something in her voice then, something tight and controlled that he recognized as the way she sounded when she was holding herself together by force of will. "Come in anyway." He came in. The inside of the house smelled like bread and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the dried wildflowers she kept in a jar on the windowsill, flowers that June had brought in from the pasture in August, and that Theodora had not been able to make herself throw away even as they faded. June was not home, she was still at school, and Ira was acutely aware of this, of being alone with Theodora in the quiet kitchen, of the clock on the wall that was a different clock than the sheriff's but ticking with the same terrible precision. She poured him coffee without asking. She set it on the table and looked at him. "Sit down, Ira." He sat. He wrapped his hands around the cup because the warmth was grounding, because it gave him something to hold onto while the rest of him was entirely unmoored. He looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the small chip in the edge that had been there when he arrived, and would be there long after he was gone. "Horace Webb says he can fight it," Theodora said. She sat down across from him, not with her coffee, just with her hands folded in front of her, watching his face. "He says the order isn't legal. He also says it'll take 2 weeks and Prescott will have me locked up in a ditch before the week is out if I stay." Ira looked up at her. "I can't fight it from here. Prescott's in Cal's pocket all the way to the elbow." She was quiet for a moment. The clock ticked. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse was moving at a slow walk, and the sound of its hooves on the packed earth came through the window clearly in the silence. "I know," she said at last. "I know you have to go." Something about the way she said it, not resigned, not defeated, but with a quality of acceptance that nonetheless contained within it a kind of grief, made his chest ache in a way that was very nearly unbearable. Theodora. Her name in his mouth felt like something he had been saving for a long time. She looked at him. "I have to tell you something before I go." He set the cup down and made himself look directly at her, because he had held this in for 14 months and he was leaving in less than an hour, and he would rather say it badly than not say it at all. "I know the timing is wrong. I know this isn't the moment for it, and I know that you've got enough on your hands without me adding complications to the pile. But Ira," her voice was soft. "Please let me say it," he said. "I won't get another chance." She was very still. The afternoon light moved on the wall beside her as a cloud passed over the sun outside, and the room went briefly softer, and she was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between pain and something else. "I love you," he said. The words came out steadier than his hands, which seemed right somehow, because they had been solid inside him for a long time, weight-bearing, the kind of thing a man builds the rest of his days around without always knowing it. "I have loved you since October of last year when you shook my hand at the gate, and told me you didn't have patience for being managed, and I have been trying not to make it your problem ever since, and I'm sorry that I'm making it your problem now, at the worst possible time. But I couldn't ride out of this territory without you knowing." Theodora Finley did not move for a long moment. She sat across from him at her kitchen table with her hands folded on the wood and her dark hair coming out of its pins and flower still on her right hand, and she looked at him with those brown eyes that saw everything, and Ira held himself very still and waited for whatever was coming. What came was not what he expected. She reached across the table and put her flour-dusted hand over his shaking ones. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." A pause, careful and honest. "I have been trying to decide what to do about it." He stared at her hand on his. "Theodora." "I lost Charles 2 years ago," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that had weight and age and genuine complexity. "I have June to think about. I have this land and this fight and about 400 things that need doing before winter. I told myself I didn't have room for anything else." She stopped. She took a breath. "I have been telling myself that for months, and I have been wrong about it for just as long. And I think I knew it every time I sat on that porch and talked to you in the evenings. I just couldn't. I wasn't ready." He turned his hand over under hers so they were palm to palm, and he held on carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid of breaking. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to wait. I'm not asking you to—" "I know what you're not asking for," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm choosing." Her eyes were very bright, not with tears but with something that looked like decision, like the particular clarity a person reaches when they've been deliberating a long time and have finally landed on solid ground. "I'm choosing to tell you that I think about you every morning and every evening and quite a lot of the hours in between, and that this house is going to be very quiet when you leave it, and that I do not want you to go." His throat had closed entirely. "I have to go," he managed. "I know you do," she pressed his hands, "but you come back." Her voice dropped to something very quiet, very serious, the voice she used when she meant something absolutely and without reservation. "You hear me, Ira Brooks. You come back. You may be in the middle of a legal battle by then," he said. "You may have won it or lost it. Everything may look different. Then we will figure it out when everything looks different." She held his gaze. "Come back." The clock on the wall said he had 23 minutes. He was going to have to ride hard to make the territorial line in time, and he still had to collect his saddle and his bedroll from the bunkhouse at the edge of Theodora's property where he had been sleeping for over a year, and he should have already been moving. He knew all of this. He stayed where he was for another long moment, holding her hand across the kitchen table, looking at her face in the October light, memorizing it. "I'll come back," he said. "I give you my word." She nodded once, and he could see that she believed him, and that believing him cost her something, because believing a man who was about to ride away was not a small act of faith for a woman who had already buried one. He stood. He took her hand and held it for one more second and then made himself let go. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it without noticing. He moved toward the door. "Ira." He turned. She had stood too, and she was close, closer than he had realized. And she reached up and put her hand briefly against his jaw the way you touch something you intend to keep. And she looked at him with those seeing eyes, and then she said simply, "Be safe." He pressed his hand over hers for just a moment, his rough palm against the back of her hand, and then he went. He went out the blue door and through the gate, and he was running by the time he hit the road, running toward the bunkhouse, because he had 17 minutes and a hard ride ahead, and he would keep his word to her or die trying. The territorial line was a stone marker at the edge of a dry creek bed 12 miles south of Caldwell, and Ira crossed it with 3 minutes to spare on a horse named Birch that had been his own property for 2 years, a brown and white paint that had more endurance than elegance but had never once failed him. He crossed it and pulled up on the other side and turned to look back north, back toward the flat golden country he was leaving, and he sat there for a moment with the wind coming across the grass and his heart still hammering from the ride. He had said it. She had heard it. She had said come back. He turned Birch south toward Indian Territory and the town of Hunwell just across the line, and he began to think. He was not a man given to being idle, which was fortunate, because the weeks that followed required more active thinking and maneuvering than anything he had undertaken in his 32 years. He found a room in Hunwell at a boarding house run by a wide, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Cord, who fed him well and asked no questions beyond the practical, and he spent the first week writing letters. He wrote to Horace Webb in Wichita and received, within 4 days, a densely written response that laid out the specific legal weaknesses in Prescott's exile order. The order had been issued under a territorial nuisance provision that required a petition from at least 3 property owners, and the petition attached to Ira's order bore only 2 signatures. The third had been forged, and Webb had found the discrepancy by requesting the original filing from the county clerk's office, a clerk who turned out to be considerably more ethical than his employer. He wrote to the Wichita paper, whose editor, a compact, energetic man named Samuel Greer, had been quietly gathering material on Burton Cowell's land acquisition practices for the better part of a year. Greer published a piece in the second week of November that named specific dates, specific properties, specific instances of legal manipulation, and specifically identified Sheriff Doyle Prescott as a participant in what was beginning to look very much like an organized scheme to dispossess small landowners along the creek drainage. He wrote to the U.S. Marshal's office in Topeka, enclosing a copy of Webb's legal analysis and Greer's newspaper piece, and he received back a letter that was non-committal in tone, but that indicated the office was reviewing the matter. And he wrote to Theodora. He wrote to her every week, plain letters on the cheap paper he bought at the Hunwell dry goods store, letters that began with the practical, what Webb had told him, what the legal situation looked like, what steps were being taken, and that always ended with something else, something he found increasingly easy to say on paper even as he knew he would have found it difficult face to face. He told her what he thought about in the evenings. He told her about the way October had looked from her doorway, the particular angle of the light. He told her he carried the memory of her hand over his like a held breath. She wrote back. He had not been certain she would, not because he doubted her feelings, but because she was a woman with very little time and a great many demands on her attention. But she wrote back, and her letters were remarkable. She wrote the way she talked, directly, without fuss, but with a warmth underneath that ran through everything. She told him about the cattle. She told him about June's school performance and about the ongoing legal proceedings. She told him about the meeting with Horace Webb in late October, at which Webb had presented the forged signature finding, and the look on Burton Cowell's attorney's face, and about how Theodora had watched that attorney's face and known in that moment that the tide was turning. She told him other things too. She told him that June had asked about him 3 times since he left, not with the overt suspicion she used to show, but with something that sounded, Theodora wrote carefully, like actual missing. She told him that she had fixed the gate latch herself, but that she had done it wrong and it was still catching, and that she found this oddly funny. She told him that she had moved her chair on the porch to face north now instead of east in the evenings, though she did not explain why and did not need to. He read that sentence 4 times. November became December, and December was cold in a way that the borderlands between Kansas and Indian Territory did not fully buffer, and Ira worked where he could find work mending fence on a neighboring ranch, doing some horse work for a trading post operator, anything that kept him useful and kept his hands busy, and kept him from simply saddling Birch and riding north, which he wanted to do every single morning when he woke up. The legal situation moved slowly, which was the nature of legal situations in 1882, and then all at once it moved quickly. In the second week of January, A U.S. Marshal named Croft arrived in Caldwell from Topeka with 2 deputies, and a document from the federal court that had the effect of voiding all pending property actions under the contested territorial nuisance provision, pending a full investigation. Burton Cowell's attorney filed 3 countering motions in 48 hours. Webb countered all 3. The Wichita paper ran a second piece. A senator from the eastern part of the state made a public statement about land fraud. Cal, who was not stupid, began to see which way the wind was blowing. The exile order against Ira Brooks was formally vacated on the 14th of January, 1883. Webb sent a telegram to Hunwell. Mrs. Cord brought it up to Ira's room herself, which meant she had been waiting for it, which told him she had known more about his situation than she had ever let on. He read the telegram twice, then sat on the edge of his bed for a few minutes looking at the wall. Then he began to pack, which did not take long because he owned very little. He told Mrs. Cord he was leaving the next morning. She cooked him a substantial breakfast in silence, and then, when he stood to go, handed him a napkin-wrapped bundle of biscuits for the road without a word, which was the most eloquent goodbye he had received in some time. It was a hard day's ride from Hunwell to Caldwell in January, with the grass bent flat by the wind, and the sky a uniform pale gray that pressed down close and gave the land a stripped, honest quality that Ira had always found oddly beautiful. He rode north with Birch moving at a good, steady pace, and the biscuits in his saddlebag and his heart doing something complicated in his chest that he did not try to name. He had told her he would come back. He was coming back. He thought about what he had not sorted out, which was considerable. He had no position at her ranch. He had not presumed to that. He had no formal understanding with her, just letters, and one afternoon in her kitchen, and her hand on his jaw. He had his horse and his saddle and his gear and the skills he had, and he had the love that had been building in him for 14 months, and that had not diminished by a single degree in the 3 months he had been away from her. That was what he had. He hoped it was enough. He reached Caldwell in the late afternoon when the light was doing its October thing again, or rather its January version of it, lower, cooler, less golden, but still extraordinary. A pale copper that lay across the buildings and the street and the frozen mud of Main Street and turned everything quietly beautiful. He rode down the street and people watched him from the boardwalk. He had not been gone long enough to be a stranger, and he had left in circumstances public enough that his return was noted. He tipped his hat at Gus Esteban, who was coming out of the feed store and who grinned at him openly. He did not stop at the saloon or the boarding house or anywhere else. He rode south of town, along the road he knew better than any other road in the world, to the gate with the latch that would be sticking on the left side. He tied Birch at the post and went to the gate and worked the latch. It was, as Theodora had written, catching on the left side, and he could see immediately what the problem was and fixed it in about 30 seconds with a stick he found in the dirt and used to adjust the set of the pin. He swung the gate open and shut twice to confirm it worked, and then he stood there with his hat in his hand looking at the blue door. The light was going from copper to something darker, and the air was very cold, and he could see smoke coming from the chimney in a thin straight column that meant no wind at the house right now. Someone was inside. Someone had a fire going. His hands were shaking. They had been shaking when he stood here 3 months ago, and they were shaking now, and he thought that this was possibly just what his hands did in the presence of this house, in the presence of the prospect of this woman. He walked up the path. He stood at the door. He knocked. The sound of footsteps inside, quick and light, and then a pause that was long enough that he understood she was standing on the other side of the door composing herself, which told him something important. And then the door opened and Theodora Finley stood in the doorway in a green dress he had not seen before, with her hair pinned up more carefully than usual, and her brown eyes very bright, and her hands holding onto the doorframe with a grip that told him she needed the steadying. They looked at each other. "You fixed my gate," she said. "The pin was set wrong," he said. "It was always going to catch." She made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely, And then she stepped forward and Ira opened his arms and she walked into them. And he held her there on the porch of her house in the January cold with his hat falling somewhere into the dirt, and his face bent down into her hair, and his whole self settling into something that felt, with profound certainty, like a rival. She held on. He held on. After a long moment she said, muffled against his coat, "June has been asking about you every day since the telegram. You told her I was coming. I told her you might be coming. I didn't want to pause. I didn't want to promise her something and then have it be wrong." He understood that. He understood what that caution cost her and why she exercised it, and he held her a little tighter for a moment. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here and I'm not planning on going anywhere." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was making a serious assessment, steady and direct and utterly without pretense. He let her look. He had nothing to hide from her. "That's a considerable statement," she said. "I mean it as a considerable statement." She looked at him a moment longer and then she nodded. The single decisive nod that he had learned meant she had reached a conclusion and was committing to it. "Then you had better come in and eat something," she said. "You look like you have been surviving on boarding house food for 3 months. I have been surviving on boarding house food for 3 months. I made a stew." She stepped back to let him in. "There's enough." There was more than enough. There was a stew with carrots and salt pork and potatoes, and there was bread that was still warm, and there was June at the table who looked at Ira when he came in with an expression that cycled from surprise to something intensely calculating, and then, as he sat down across from her, settled into a cautious, grave kind of relief that was one of the more genuinely moving things he had ever seen on a person's face. "You came back," June said. "I said I would." She considered this. She was a serious child with her mother's directness and her late father's coloring lighter hair, blue eyes, and she had the quality of someone who took information in and processed it very carefully before committing to a reaction. "Mama said you might," she said. "Your mama was being careful," Ira said, "which is the right thing to be, but I'm here." June picked up her spoon and looked at her bowl. "The north fence needs mending," she said. "Third post from the creek is listing." Theodora pressed her hand over her mouth. Ira kept a straight face with considerable effort. "I'll have a look at it tomorrow," he said. June nodded, apparently satisfied, and began eating her stew with the purposeful focus of someone who had discharged an important duty and could now attend to other matters. Theodora met Ira's eyes across the table, and the look they exchanged contained about 40 different things at once, and none of them required words. He stayed for supper, and he helped wash up after, and he sat by the fire for an hour while June, who had gradually moved from the far side of the room to the chair nearest to his, showed him a drawing she had made of what she described as a very good horse. It was not an accurate anatomical representation of a horse, but it was rendered with great confidence, and he told her so honestly, and she looked pleased. When June went to bed, Theodora walked Ira to the door, and they stood there in the cold air from the open door with the firelight behind them, and there was a quality to the moment that was very still, very serious, the kind of moment that people remember accurately for the rest of their lives because everything about it is exactly right. "There's a lot that isn't settled yet," Theodora said. "The cow business, the property status. I don't know what the next 6 months look like." "I know," he said. "I'm not easy to be with," she said. "I have opinions and I am not interested in deferring to someone else's judgment just because it's expected of me, and I have a child who is a full human being with her own complicated inner life, and I have 43 head of cattle and a horse operation, and I cannot promise you that any of it will be Theodora." His voice was very gentle. She stopped. "I know all of that," he said. "I have been here for 14 months. I know exactly who you are and what your life is, and I am not asking you to be different. I am asking to be part of it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved in the grass somewhere out in the dark. "Then come back in the morning," she said. "Come back in the morning and fix that fence post, and we will figure out the rest as we go." "That's a considerable statement," he said, giving her words back to her. She smiled. It was the full smile, the unguarded one, and he thought it was the most valuable thing he had ever been allowed to see. "I mean it as one," she said. He walked back to town that evening with his hat in his hand, and the cold stars enormous overhead and the grass moving in the dark around him. And he felt something he had not felt in a long time, something easy and certain and deeply, quietly right. The sensation of being where you are supposed to be, pointed in the direction you are supposed to go. He found a room at the boarding house in town, Mrs. Haverford's place on the second cross street, run by a stout woman of about 50, who had a reputation for cleanliness and firm opinions about breakfast times. And he was up before dawn and riding south again in a cold gray morning with frost on the grass, and his breath making small clouds in the air. He found the fence post June had mentioned without any trouble. She had been correct that it was listing, and he spent the better part of 2 hours resetting it properly in the frozen ground, which required more work than it would have in warmer weather, but which he approached without complaint, because this fence was the boundary of this land, and this land was Theodora's, and anything that protected it was worth the effort. She came out with coffee at mid-morning, picking her way across the frozen ground in her boots, and she stood beside him while he finished packing the earth around the base of the post, and they talked about practical things, the cattle, the legal situation, what Webb had written most recently, and it was simultaneously the most ordinary conversation he had ever had and the one that filled him up the most. Over the weeks that followed, a shape emerged. He came every morning. He worked the property the way he had always worked it, without being asked, with the detailed knowledge of 14 months. He took his meals with them more often than not. He spent his evenings in town because it was 1883, and Caldwell was not the kind of place where appearances didn't matter, and he was not going to do anything that would compromise Theodora's standing in the community, which she had built carefully and which she valued. But between morning and evening there was a whole long day, and those days had a quality to them that he had not had before, a warmth and a purpose, and a sense of being genuinely alive in the specific present moment, rather than simply moving through time. In late February, Bert and Cal left Caldwell. It was not a dramatic departure. He was simply gone one morning, and the word was that he had moved his operation further west into newer territory, where the legal complications were less developed. His attorney settled the remaining contested claims with the terms entirely unfavorable to Cal's side, and the Finley property boundaries were confirmed by the county land office with a new filing that Horace Webb executed personally, and that he sent to Theodora with a note that said only, "It is done. Good luck to you." Theodora read that note at the kitchen table and put it down with very careful hands and then sat quietly for a moment. And Ira watched her absorb it and saw the release in her, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a slow unclenching of something that had been held tight for a very long time. She pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes and then she looked up at him, and her expression was open and undisguised in a way she usually held in reserve. "It's over," she said. "It is," he said. "Charles bought this land with everything we had," she said. "He was so proud of it." She stopped. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not crying now, but she was feeling something complex and layered, and he could see it. "I wanted to keep it, not just for practical reasons. I wanted to keep what he built." "You kept it," Ira said. "You did that yourself." She shook her head a little. "I didn't do it alone." "You led it," he said. "Webb, the neighbors, all of it, you organized that. You stood up in that church and laid it all out, and I watched you do it, and I knew." He stopped, recalibrated. "You did it, Theodora." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "You told me that evening," she said, "at my door, that you had loved me since that first day at the gate." "I did." That was, she paused, choosing her words. "That was the first time anyone had said something like that to me, and I had believed it completely, immediately, without doubt." He had not expected that. He looked at her. "I was terrified," she said, with the plain candor that was her most essential quality. "I was terrified because I felt it too, and I didn't know what to do with it." And then you were gone, and I had to figure out what I was going to do with it while you were gone. And what I figured out was that I don't actually want to live in a world where I am only managing and sustaining, and never," she stopped again. "I want more than that. I think I am allowed to want more than that." "You are absolutely allowed to want more than that," he said. She smiled slightly, the careful one that was different from the big unguarded one and equally precious. "I thought you might say something like that." The evening of the day the legal matter was finally settled, Ira went back to his room at Mrs. Haverford's boarding house and sat on the edge of his bed for a while thinking very seriously. He had been coming to her property every day for 2 months. He had been eating at her table and playing cards with June after supper, and talking with Theodora on the porch in the evenings until the cold drove them in. He knew the depth of what he felt for her, and he was increasingly certain of what she felt for him, and the legal battle that had been the most pressing concern was now resolved. He thought about Charles Finley, whose ghost lived in the house in the most decent and benign way, in the way Theodora spoke of him sometimes, honestly and without excess sentimentality, as a man she had loved and lost, and who had deserved better from time. He did not feel competition with Charles Finley's memory. He felt something more like respect, and a quiet determination to be the kind of man that Charles Finley's daughter and wife could trust. He thought about June. June, who had started standing closer to him when he was working, who had started telling him things, small observations about the horses, opinions about weather, the way you tell things only to people you have decided to trust, who had asked him last week with her characteristic directness whether he knew how to fish, and when he said he did, had said simply, "Good," and walked away, which he suspected was an invitation of some kind. He thought about the gate he had fixed 4 times. He thought about the view from the porch. He thought about the particular way Theodora tilted her head when she was deciding something. He made up his mind. He went to see Reverend Thomas Alcott the following morning, before he rode out to the property. Alcott was a spare, serious man in his late 40s who ran the Methodist Church with a combination of genuine pastoral warmth and unyielding practicality that Ira had always appreciated. He found him in the church cleaning the pews with a rag and a bucket, which seemed about right. He stated his intentions plainly. Alcott listened without interruption, finished wiping the pew he was working on, and then turned to look at Ira with an expression of measured satisfaction. "Mrs. Finley is a fine woman," Alcott said, "and she has had a very hard 2 years." "She has," Ira said. "And you have been working her property for over a year and behaving, as far as anyone can observe, with complete integrity." "I've tried to." Alcott was quiet for a moment. "You'll speak to her first, I presume." "That's the next stop. Then you'll have my blessing when you need it," Alcott said, and turned back to his pew. Ira rode south. He found Theodora in the barn, which was where she was most mornings, checking the horses before the day got moving. She was running her hand along the neck of a gray mare named Patience, and talking to the horse in a low murmur the way she did when she thought no one was listening, and she turned when she heard him, and the morning light came in through the barn door behind him, and she looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "You're here early. I wanted to talk to you before the day got away from us." She came out of the stall and latched it, and she stood in the middle of the barn aisle with the smell of hay and horses around them and looked at him patiently. He had thought about how to say this. He had composed several versions in his head on the ride over and abandoned all of them, and what came out was very plain, which was probably right. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me. I know it's a large thing to ask, and I know that you've been on your own for 2 years and that you've run this place by yourself and you don't need me here. But I want to be here. I want to be here every morning and every evening and all the time in between, and I want to be someone June can count on, and I want to build something with you on this land that the 2 of you have already built into something good, if you'll have me." Theodora was very still. The gray mare shifted in her stall. A swallow darted through the open barn door and out again. The light lay in gold bands across the straw-covered floor. "Ira Brooks," Theodora said slowly. "Yes." I have been waiting, she said, for you to say that for approximately 6 weeks. He blinked. I knew it was coming, she said, with the absolute calm of someone who had simply accepted a truth some time ago and had been waiting for the external world to catch up. I have been knowing it was coming. I just didn't know when, and you are apparently a very deliberate man. He stopped. You're laughing at me. I am not laughing at you. She walked toward him and stopped closer than the ordinary distance of conversation, and looked up at him with those eyes that he had spent 14 months trying and failing not to drown in. I am saying yes. I am saying it quickly and without reservation because I decided this 6 weeks ago and I did not see any point in making you wait longer than necessary to say yes. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, plainly and firmly. Yes, Ira. He cupped her face in his hands, those hands that had been shaking at her door 3 months ago and were steadier now. Steadier because she had steadied him in every possible sense. And he kissed her for the first time there in the barn with the morning light coming through the door and the horse watching with philosophical disinterest. And it was exactly right. It was warm and certain and real, and when it ended she was still close, her hands resting against his chest, and she said with her eyes closed, I think we have been building to that for quite a while. About 14 months, he said. She opened her eyes and smiled, the full unguarded one. Go tell June before she comes looking for us, she said. She is terrible at keeping secrets, and if she finds out about this from someone other than us, she will be insufferable about it. He did. He found June at the fence watching the horses in the south pasture, which was how she spent most mornings when she didn't have school, and he walked up beside her and stood there for a moment and then said carefully, Your mother and I have something to tell you. June looked at him sideways. You asked her. He paused. You knew. You have been acting like you were about to ask for weeks, June said, with the world weariness of a 9-year-old who has clearly been observing adults far more closely than they realized. Are you getting married? She said yes, he said. June turned this over. She looked back at the horses. She was quiet for long enough that he felt a small thread of anxiety, and then she said quietly and with a seriousness that carried real weight, My father loved this land. I know, he said. Your mother told me about him. He sounds like a good man. He was, a pause. I don't want to forget him. Ira crouched down to her level there at the fence, and he looked at her directly the way she always looked at everyone else. You won't forget him, he said. We're not going to ask you to. He was your father and he built this place, and that's part of your life and it always will be. I'm not here to replace him. I'm here because I love your mother and I want to be part of this family. Those are different things. June looked at him for a long moment with those assessing blue eyes. Then she said, Can you fix the latch on the chicken coop? It has been sticking since September. He had to work very hard to keep his face straight. Yes, he said. I'll fix it today. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and climbed through the fence into the pasture to go talk to the horses, which seemed to be her equivalent of a conclusion reached and accepted. They were married on the 15th of March, 1883, at the Methodist Church, with Reverend Alcott officiating and Gus Esteban and his wife Maria in the front pew and Horace Webb, who had ridden up from Wichita for the occasion, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was clearly new and considerably better than his usual brown one. June stood next to her mother in a dress the color of summer grass, and held her mother's flowers with the focused solemnity of someone who has been assigned an important responsibility and intends to execute it perfectly. Theodora wore a dress the color of deep blue sky, not white. She had made this decision herself, and it suited her completely, suited her practicality and her directness. And the fact that she was not pretending this was a first beginning but acknowledging it as a true one, which was, Ira thought, exactly right. She had her hair down, something she almost never did, and it fell past her shoulders in dark waves, and she was, standing there in the March light coming through the church windows, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When Alcott asked him if he took this woman, Ira said yes with the absolute certainty of a man who has never been more sure of anything in his life. When Alcott asked her, Theodora said yes clearly and directly and without hesitation, and then, because she was Theodora, added in a quieter voice that was not really for the congregation, but that the congregation heard anyway, without reservation, and there was a ripple of warmth through the small gathering that Ira felt in his chest. The spring that followed was, Ira would think later in the many years after, the most content and purposeful season of his life. He was where he was supposed to be, doing work he knew and valued, on land that was now as much his to care for as anyone's, coming in every evening to a house that was lit and warm, to a woman who met him with honesty and warmth, to a child who had decided, in her own time and on her own terms, to let him be part of her life. He fixed the chicken coop latch. He fixed the north fence completely, not just the listing post but the whole run, which needed it. He broke 2 horses that spring that Theodora had bought at a favorable price, because they were difficult, and both of them turned out to be good working animals with patience applied. He expanded the hay storage before summer so they would not run short in the next winter the way they nearly had in January. He and Theodora talked on the porch every evening when the weather allowed, and inside when it didn't, with the fire going and June nearby doing her lessons or her drawing, and those conversations ranged across everything: the property, the cattle market, the news from town, the letters from Webb who had become something like a friend through the trial of the legal battle. But they ranged into other territory too, into the kind of talking that is really a form of knowing each other, where you say the things you have held quiet and find that they are received with care. He told her about the 6 drifting years before Caldwell, about what he had been looking for without knowing what it was, about the loneliness that had been so habitual he had stopped registering it as loneliness and had simply called it independence. She listened with her coffee cup in her hands and her eyes quiet. She told him about Charles, not too much, the right amount, enough for him to understand the shape of that life and loss. Charles had been kind, she said, genuinely kind and hardworking and good, and she had loved him, and she had grieved him completely, and grief, she said, was not disloyalty but its own kind of completion, and she had completed it before Ira arrived, even if she had not fully known it. He told her he was glad she had had that, glad she had been loved that way before, and he meant it truly. She looked at him over the rim of her cup and said, "You are a genuinely good man, Ira Brooks," with the plain certainty of a woman making an honest assessment, and he felt that go through him like light. In September of that year, Theodora told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning before the day started, standing in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She said it plainly, watching his face. He stood very still for a moment, feeling the information settle into him and take root, and then he went to her and held her very carefully with a kind of reverence that was new to him, and she relaxed against him, and he felt her exhale something she had been holding. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "A little tired, but well. June," he said, "I haven't told her yet. I wanted to tell you first." They told June that evening. June received the information with her characteristic deliberateness, then said, with a slight frown that was more thoughtfulness than concern, "Will the baby sleep in my room or the other room?" "The other room," Theodora said. June nodded. "Good, I need quiet to read," and she went back to her book, apparently satisfied. Theodora looked at Ira, and the look on her face was the one he loved most, the full, unguarded one, the one that wasn't for anyone else, that she gave only when she was genuinely happy and knew it. The baby came in April of 1884, a boy they named William Charles Brooks, William for Ira's own father and Charles for the man who had first loved this land and this woman, which was Theodora's idea, and which told him everything about her character that he already knew and continued to be grateful for. William was loud from the first hour and red-faced, and showed every indication of possessing enormous opinions about the world, which his mother found amusing, and his father found deeply familiar in ways he could not entirely explain. June, who had braced herself for an intrusion, came undone at the sight of him completely, and spent the first 2 weeks offering to hold him with a frequency that required gentle management. The years moved the way years do when you are well placed in your life. Not slowly, not without effort or trouble or the ordinary difficult things that come to everyone, but with a quality of substance and meaning that made even the hard days feel purposeful. There were dry summers and hard winters and cattle lost to illness one year, and the difficult task of navigating a relationship with the county that had been adversarial and had to be rebuilt. There were the smaller complications, a horse that injured itself badly and had to be put down, which hit Theodora harder than she showed. A disagreement between them in the fall of 1885 that was serious enough to require 2 days of honest conversation to resolve, and that resolved them into something deeper and more solid than they had been before, which was the nature of genuine conflict handled with genuine respect. June grew in the way serious, careful children sometimes do into someone of remarkable competence and quiet, unwavering integrity. At 12, she was running parts of the property administration with a precision that embarrassed some of the adults she interacted with. At 14, she had opinions about land law that Horace Webb, who visited once a year and had become genuinely fond of the Finley Brooks family, said were better informed than those of half his colleagues. William, by contrast, grew into someone considerably louder and more kinetic than his father, with his mother's directness and none of her restraint, who had by the age of 4 communicated to the horses, the dogs, the chickens, and most of the neighboring children that he was in charge of all operations and would be taking direction from no one. June managed him with the calm authority of someone significantly older and more powerful, which was probably healthy. Theodora, in the winter of 1886, told Ira she was pregnant again. She told him this time with a different quality to her face, not apprehensive but fully certain, the face of someone who has done this before and knows her own life well enough to receive news into it without reorganizing around it. A second one, he said. Apparently so. She looked at him with warmth and amusement and the steadiness that was simply, he had come to understand, the ground frequency of who she was. "Are you alarmed?" "Not even slightly," he said. The second child was a girl, born in July of 1886 on a hot, flat afternoon with the windows open and the sound of the cattle in the pasture coming in on the still air. They named her Clara Me. She arrived with her eyes apparently already open and her expression one of alert interest, which Ira said to Theodora in the first quiet hour meant she was going to be trouble, and Theodora said she couldn't imagine where the child got that. And they looked at each other over the baby's head with the look that contained everything, all of it, all the years and all the days and all the mornings riding south on Birch and all the evenings on the porch. June held Clara with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and the particular expression of someone who is trying to appear unaffected while being entirely, helplessly affected. William wanted to know, with some urgency, whether Clara would be able to work horses by next spring, and had to be gently advised that the timeline would need adjusting. The spring of 1887 came mild and green across the South Kansas flats, the grass coming up thick after a good wet winter, the creek running high and clear along the southern boundary of the property. Ira rode out early one morning to check the east fence line, the part that ran along the creek, and he stopped Birch on the rise above the water and looked out across the land in the early light. He thought about the sheriff's office and the ticking clock. He thought about standing in the middle of Main Street with a paper in his pocket and shaking hands, and knowing he was going to walk to her door even though he had no right to and nothing clear to offer. He thought about the afternoon light coming through the doorway between them, full of dust and the particular gold of October. He thought about her hand over his on the kitchen table. "Come back," she had said. He had come back. He had been coming back ever since, every morning, every day, and would be coming back on every morning of every day for as long as he had them. The land lay quiet and enormous, and his in all the ways that mattered, not legally his, not primarily his, but his to tend and protect and be part of, his because the person who was most fully his in all the world had given him the privilege of standing on it. He could see the house from here, smoke from the chimney already, which meant Theodora was up and the fire was going, and somewhere in that house were his children and his stepdaughter, and all the particular rich ordinary complexity of a life that was, by any honest measure, exactly what a person should hope for. He turned Birch back toward the house. When he came in through the back, Theodora was standing at the stove with her back to him, and she heard him come in and said, without turning, "Clara is still sleeping. Don't wake her." "I wasn't going to wake her." "You always wake her. You come in and your boots are loud on the floor and she wakes up." He took his boots off at the door. He crossed the kitchen in his stocking feet and came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against him, a small unconscious movement, the kind you only make with someone you trust entirely. "The east fence looks good," he said. "The east fence has always been fine," she said. "It's the south run I'm worried about." "That post you put in last fall, the soil shifts in the spring thaw," he said. "I know, I'll check it this week." She turned slightly and looked at him over her shoulder, and he could see the side of her smile. "You know," she said, "when I put that posting up in the Wichita paper, I was looking for someone to help me mend fence and work cattle. And I found someone to mend fence and work cattle," she said, "and rather more than that." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head, her dark hair warm from the fire. "Rather more," he agreed. June came down the stairs carrying Clara, who had, apparently, woken herself, and who was regarding the morning with her customary air of someone who has opinions about it. William came behind them at a volume that suggested he had been awake for hours, and had been waiting for permission to commence operations, and the kitchen filled up immediately with the sound and movement of a full household beginning a full day, and Theodora turned fully from the stove and began distributing bowls of porridge with the efficient warmth of someone completely at home in their own life. Ira sat at the table where he had first sat, with shaking hands and cold coffee and 3 months of silence, and the knowledge that he was about to ride away, and he looked at the room and the people in it, and felt the particular, irreducible satisfaction of a man who went back when he said he would. The land was Theodora's. The fight for it was won. The blue door was open every morning he came to it, and the latch on the gate worked correctly, and in the south pasture the cattle were fat and the grass was coming in green, and the woman he loved was moving around the kitchen telling William to sit down and handing Clara a spoon she was going to immediately throw on the floor, and June was reading at the table, and outside the window the sky over the Kansas flats was the enormous, indifferent, brilliant blue that had always made Ira feel like the world was worth whatever it asked of you. He reached across the table and picked up the spoon before it hit the floor and handed it back to Clara, who looked at him with enormous dark eyes, her mother's eyes, and then with complete deliberateness threw it on the floor again. "Clara," Theodora said, without turning from the stove. "She did it on purpose," William reported. "I know she did it on purpose," Theodora said. "Why doesn't she get in trouble? She's 9 months old, William." "When I was 9 months old, when you were 9 months old, you pulled a full pot of flour off the shelf, and I aged 10 years in an afternoon," Theodora said. "You have very little standing here." June turned a page without looking up. "This is accurate," she said. Ira picked up the spoon again and gave it back to Clara, and this time held her small hand around it, and she looked at him with those serious dark eyes, and he felt the full weight of it, all of it, the whole extraordinary, ordinary, precious weight of it, and it was the best feeling he had ever known. Outside, Birch stood at the post with his head down, eating the last of the morning grass. The brown and white paint horse who had carried him across a territorial line with 3 minutes to spare, and who had carried him back again when the law allowed it, and who showed no signs of philosophical interest in anything other than the grass and the water and the next day's work, which was probably the right attitude. The day opened ahead of them like land opens, wide and requiring, full of the particular beauty of things that need doing by the right hands. Theodora set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, and he looked up at her, and she looked back at him, and in her eyes was the full, clear knowledge of everything. The October afternoon, and the shaking hands, and the blue door, and the letters, and the legal fight, and the March wedding, and the children, and the years of mornings, and the years still coming. And she covered his hand briefly with hers, the way she had across the kitchen table in the first hour of everything. He turned his hand over and held on. Outside, the Kansas morning moved across the grass in gold, and the cattle in the south pasture lowed and shifted in the new spring warmth, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into the blue sky in a thin white column, visible for a long way out across the flat land, a signal fire, a mark on the world that said, "Here is where the living is. Here is where the people who matter to each other have gathered to build the particular unrepeatable thing of a life held in common. And it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything."